Check the description for the following discount codes.
Probably one of the most common questions I've been asked about my triple 4K display in the background there that I've recently built is what graphics card I'm running, what frame rates I get, and how did I manage to run 4K on each screen out of a current generation graphics card, which usually only has one HDMI 2.1 output and then 3 or 4 display ports. Now there are the gigabyte cards that have 3 HDMI outputs. I actually initially thought they were all 2.1, but it turns out 2 of them are HDMI 2.1 and the middle one is HDMI 2.0B. So if you wanted to run 4K at 120 Hertz with HDR functioning and G-Sync, you run into trouble because you need to have HDMI 2.1 to be able to do all those features. But here's what I've done and here's why it's not an issue for me. I have an RTX 3080. It's not a gigabyte one, so it has one HDMI 2.1 port and 3 display ports, 1.4. So I've got my HDMI port running my ultra-wide monitor, which is here, and those 3 displays you see in the background are running using Displayport to HDMI adapters. Now, there's a few different ones out there. I already had some in the first place, these Cable Matters ones, and this is what a Displayport adapter to HDMI looks like, in case you wondered. These don't have the bandwidth to do what we need for that. So whatever you do, don't buy a Cable Matters one. They don't have enough bandwidth. The only ones that do work for the application that I've got here, which I'll explain in a second, is Startech branded ones. And I'll put a link in the description. They're active and they're about 30 quid each, so they're not cheap if you need 3 like I did. Now, these still won't do 4K at 120 Hertz with HDR and G-Sync. Now you might be thinking, well, what use is that then, Carl? Well, the reason it's very useful is because there's no current graphics cards that can run 3 4K screens at 120 Hertz with in-game graphics maxed out. So why does it matter? For me, my 3080, yes, there's a 3080 Ti and there is of course a 3090, but in gaming performance, even the 3090 is only between 5 and maybe 10% faster than a 3080. So if we're talking FPS, that would be if you've got 100 FPS on your 3080, you might get 110 or 115 on a 3090. It's not a massive difference. So if you can't run 3 4K screens at 4K and get a good frame rate, what's the point? There isn't any point. Now your options are drop the in-game graphics down so low that they start to look like a PlayStation 1 game, bland, no shadows, low resolution textures, really poor lighting effects, ruins the whole experience, but you can run 4K so it all looks sharp, very bland but sharp, and a good FPS at 4K. Or you can do what I did, which is drop from 4K to 1440p, which is still nice and sharp, and this is like, you know, no word of a lie, try it yourself. 1440p at 55 inches still looks pin sharp, but I can run everything maxed out. So let's take Assetto Corsa Competizione, for example. I have that all on ultra, anti-aliased up to the max, everything, literally everything maxed out, and I get between 80 and 100 FPS at 1440p. And those Startech adapters have the bandwidth to do 1440p at 120 Hertz with HDR and G-Sync or FreeSync. I don't have an AMD card to check, but G-Sync works just fine. So that, for me, is the perfect compromise with the graphics cards we have available today. Now, next-gen cards may well come with more HDMI 2.1 ports because HDMI 2.1 has greater bandwidth than what DisplayPort 1.4 does. So they're probably going to head that way anyway. But for now, to me, having a much more visually pleasing and realistic appearance is way more important because it's the lighting effects and the shadows and the textures that make these sims look and feel realistic when you're sat there racing. if you have to turn everything, down, so it looks a bit bland and, you've got no anti-aliasing on, so you've got jagged edges, but it's pin sharp at 4K. That is not a good experience, at least not for me. I don't want it to look like a 5-year-old game, but really, really crisp, because all I'm seeing is really crisp, low quality graphics. I'd rather drop to 1440p, which is, as I say, still plenty sharp enough. Get, my 80 to 100 FPS G-synced in HDR, with all the gloss turned on, so have reflections and shadows and textures and all the lighting effects just look amazing. You've seen the footage from my last video, I imagine. It just looks so realistic, and that's what it's like when you're sat there in the cockpit. So that's what I've done. I'm using Startech adapters, which I'll link to. They'll do 1440p at 120 Hz with HDR and G-Sync all day long. But what you must also do is buy a decent HDMI cable. Cheaper HDMI cables won't have the bandwidth, just like cheaper Displayport to HDMI adapters don't have the bandwidth. And I use CSL branded cables. They're quite thick, they're very, very well made, and I'll link to those in the description as well. And also to note, you do get voltage drop off over certain lengths of cable. They recommend not using cables any longer than 7 meters. Now for me, that was a bit of a problem because I needed 10-meter cables to reach where, because my computer's here beside me and my rig is over there. And the CSL cables are working fine at 10 meters in length. That's what I've got, 3 of those coming back to 3 Startech Displayport to HDMI adapters. And they're all working perfectly, as you've all seen in footage and as you can see behind me now. So yeah, that's what I'm doing. RTX 3080 Startech Displayport to HDMI adapters at 1440p, 120 Hz, HDR, everything maxed out in game, hitting 80 to 100 FPS. And for me, that is the best balance for the GPU power we have available now. Come the next generation ones that are going to be faster still, and hopefully with some HDMI 2.1 ports, then yes, I'll be changing the cables again because those HDMI cables probably won't do it, but they should be able to run at 4K and get a decent frame rate with the in-game graphics maxed out as well. Because to me, maxing out the graphics, or at least high if not on ultra, because there's often not much difference between high and ultra if you actually look carefully, being able to run high or ultra is so important. That's what you're looking at, that's what looks realistic. I don't want this jagged edged, grey, poor lighting, bland looking image from 5 years ago, but at 4K, and 120 Hz. It's not what I want. But it's kind of personal, I suppose. Some people may prefer it. I don't know why, but you might do. You're still going to get a nice responsive feel at 80 to 100 FPS versus 120. Maybe if you're top of the tree sim racer and you can notice the difference, and that extra 20 FPS is important to you. But even then, I would just drop down from ultra to high at 1440p, or high to medium if you need to, depending on the sim, and still have a really nice looking visual experience and get your frame rate as well. 4K really isn't necessary, in my opinion, an experience in a sim setup, even with 55-inch screens. If you were to have 100-inch screens, maybe things will start to look a little not quite as crisp, in which case 4K perhaps would be preferable. But you can all play around and you can all do whatever suits you best. But for me, that's what I did, that's how I did it. Linked in the description to the adapters and the cables I've used, and I have a really, really good experience at those settings with that hardware. So hopefully that's answered some of the questions that you've all been asking me, and will allow people to do the same thing if you want to as well. As always, take it easy.